Picture standing in the heart of an ancient city where towering temples cast long shadows over bustling marketplaces. The air hums with the chants of robed figures, their voices rising like smoke toward the heavens. These weren't just holy men, they were power brokers, whispered to hold the keys to life itself. In the earliest civilizations, from the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia to the fertile banks of the Nile, priests wielded an authority so profound it rivaled the might of kings. They didn't need armies to command obedience. Their influence seeped into every corner of society, shaping laws, dictating harvests, and even deciding the fate of empires. What made these spiritual leaders as feared as the warriors who ruled by the sword? The answer lies in a world where the divine and the political were inseparable, where gods walked among mortals, or so it seemed, and those who spoke for them held unimaginable power. Think about the last time you felt truly awestruck, maybe standing before a stormy sky or a star-filled night. Now imagine living in an era where every natural event, from a drought to a flood, was seen as a message from the gods. Ancient priests were the interpreters of those messages, the only ones who could read the divine will. They controlled the rituals that ensured good harvests, the ceremonies that appeased angry deities, and the sacred knowledge that dictated when to go to war or when to make peace. Kings might rule the land, but priests ruled the hearts and minds of the people. Their words could uplift or doom entire cities, and their blessings or curses were sought by rulers and commoners alike. This wasn't just religion, it was a sophisticated system of control, one that blended fear, hope, and unquestioned tradition into a force as potent as any army. But how did they maintain this grip for centuries? The secret lay in their mastery of the unseen. While kings collected taxes and led armies, priests controlled something far more valuable: the future. They guarded the secrets of writing, astronomy, and medicine, knowledge so powerful it was often reserved for the elite. Imagine being the only one who could predict an eclipse or interpret a dream believed to be sent by the gods. That kind of authority didn't just inspire respect, it bred terror. And when terror wasn't enough, there were the rituals, elaborate, mesmerizing performances designed to remind everyone of the priest's divine connection. From blood sacrifices to sacred dances, these acts weren't just spiritual, they were political theater, reinforcing the idea that challenging the priesthood meant challenging the gods themselves. By the time we're done, you'll see why these ancient figures weren't just spiritual guides, they were the shadow rulers of their time, and their legacy still echoes in the way power and belief intertwine today. To understand why ancient priests held such terrifying sway, you have to step into the minds of people who saw gods in every thunderclap and famine. In Mesopotamia, when the Tigris River flooded without warning, it wasn't just water rising, it was the god Enlil's anger made manifest. In Egypt, when the Nile failed to overflow, it wasn't a natural disaster, it was Ra turning his face away, and the only ones who could negotiate with these unpredictable deities. The priests, they stood between humanity and divine wrath, performing rituals so precise that a single misstep could mean ruin for an entire kingdom. Imagine the pressure and the power of being the sole person who could fix the weather, or at least convince everyone you could. This wasn't blind faith, it was a calculated system of control. Take the ancient Hittites, for example. Before a king could launch a military campaign, priests would slaughter a sheep and read its liver like a divine battle plan. If the liver's lobes were misshapen, the gods disapproved and the war was off. No general, no matter how ambitious, would dare ignore that verdict. Even more striking were the Babylonian oracle priests. who claimed to channel the god Marduk himself. Their prophecies weren't vague riddles, they were detailed directives, from tax policies to which rival kingdoms should be invaded. Kings who disobeyed risked rebellions fueled by the very people who believed their ruler had lost divine favor. But perhaps the most chilling proof of priestly power lay in their ability to make and break kings. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was called the son of Ammon, but it was the priests of Ammon who staged the coronation rituals, literally placing the crown on his head. Without their blessing, a pharaoh was just a man with an army, and when a ruler fell out of favor, the same priests could quietly spread whispers that the gods had withdrawn their support, turning the populace against him. History shows us what happened next: deposed rulers, civil wars, or worse. The lesson was clear: cross the priesthood, and you weren't just defying men, you were daring the gods to strike you down. Yet their greatest weapon wasn't fear alone, it was monopoly. In societies where literacy was rarer than gold, priests controlled the written word. Sumerian temple archives held everything from grain records to spells for curing disease. Lose a priest's favor, and suddenly your debts might disappear from the tablets, or worse, reappear with extra zeros. They even held the keys to the afterlife, with Egyptian funerary texts promising safe passage to those who paid for the correct rituals. No wonder families would bankrupt themselves for a priest's blessing. In a world where every misfortune could be divine punishment, their authority wasn't just political, it was existential. What's haunting is how little separated the sacred from the strategic. When Mayan priests climbed the steps of their pyramids to perform bloodletting ceremonies, the crowds below didn't just see a holy act, they witnessed a spectacle designed to paralyze dissent. The message was visceral. If these men could pierce their own flesh to feed the gods, what would they do to an enemy? And that's the heart of it. Ancient priests didn't just serve the gods, they mastered the art of making mortals believe they were the gods' unchallenged voice on earth. One wrong word from them and the harvest failed. One withheld blessing and a dynasty collapsed. In the end, their power wasn't carved in stone tablets, it was etched into the human psyche. The true might of the priesthood wasn't just carved into temple walls, it was etched onto clay tablets and papyrus scrolls, locked away where only the initiated could reach. Imagine living in a world where words themselves were magic, where scratching symbols onto a surface could summon rain or curse an enemy. That's the power priests held as the gatekeepers of literacy. In Mesopotamia, scribe priests didn't just record harvests, they decided who owed what to the temple, which disputes were valid, even which royal decrees were lost to time. A king might order a tax, but without a priest's stylus pressing those numbers into wet clay, it was as if the command had never existed, and it wasn't just about keeping records. Sacred knowledge was a weapon. Take the famous Venus tablet of Amassed, a Babylonian artifact tracking the planet's movements. To the average farmer, Venus was just a bright star. But to the priests, its cycles predicted droughts, wars, and plagues, information they doled out selectively to keep rulers and peasants alike dependent. Miss an eclipse prediction, blame the king's impiety, need to justify raising temple taxes, point to the stars, demanding more offerings. This wasn't astrology, it was psychological warfare wrapped in celestial mystery. The economic control was even more startling. In Egypt, temple complexes weren't just spiritual centers, they were the ancient equivalent of Wall Street. Priests managed granaries that fed cities, oversaw trade networks stretching across continents, and even ran lending operations with interest rates that would make modern bankers blush. Want a loan to plant next year's crops? You'd kneel before a priest, not a king. Default on your debt, and suddenly the gods spoke through temple envoys, demanding your land or even your children as payment. Kings collected taxes, but priests controlled the very flow of wealth, turning faith into a currency more reliable than gold. Perhaps the most insidious power lay in their role as historians. When a new dynasty rose in Sumer, it wasn't soldiers who erased the old king's name from monuments. It was priests washing clay tablets clean to rewrite the past. A defeated ruler didn't just lose his throne, he vanished from the collective memory, his triumphs recast as failures, his lineage severed by a scribe's careful omissions. Who needs an army when you control what future generations will believe? This was power that outlasted bronze swords and palace coups, echoing down centuries in the stories people told about their own origins. Yet their greatest trick was making it all seem inevitable. By framing every transaction, every law, every celestial event as the will of the gods, priests ensured no one thought to question the system. A poor farmer handing over his last bushel of grain wasn't being robbed, he was earning divine favor. A king executing rivals wasn't ruthless, he was fulfilling temple prophecies. This seamless blend of spirituality and control created a world where obedience felt like piety, where questioning authority meant risking cosmic chaos. And at the center of it all stood the priesthood, their ink-stained fingers quietly pulling the strings of empires. Consider the temple complexes of ancient Thebes, not just stone and mortar, but sprawling, humming engines of commerce. While kings minted coins, priests controlled something far more valuable, the essentials of survival. Granaries taller than palaces held enough grain to feed cities for years. Storerooms overflowed with olive oil, linen, and honey, not for rituals, but as bargaining chips in backroom deals. The Temple of Ammon at Karnak didn't just receive offerings. It operated like a modern corporation, with scribes tracking thousands of head of cattle, fleets of ships, and even entire villages under its ownership. When a pharaoh needed funds for a military campaign, he didn't go to his treasury. He negotiated with high priests for loans from sacred reserves. This wealth wasn't passive. Temples functioned as ancient hedge funds, investing in trade expeditions and charging interest on loans. A clay tablet from Babylon details how the Temple of Shamash lent silver to merchants at 20% interest, with defaulters forced to pledge their family as collateral. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, Hittite temples cornered the market on precious metals, fixing prices by controlling how much silver entered circulation. Kings could seize a throne, but only priests could manipulate an entire economy with a nod. The genius lay in making devotion profitable. Pilgrims visiting Egypt's Oracle of Ammon didn't just pray, they paid for dream interpretations, healing amulets, and mandatory sacrifices. A single festival could flood temple coffers with more gold than a year's royal taxes, and woe to the ruler who threatened this flow. When Pharaoh Akhenaten dared to shut down traditional cults, the priesthood retaliated by quietly draining grain reserves, sparking famine until he was overthrown. Their message was clear: you might wear the crown, but we control the bread that feeds your people. Most chilling was their grip on crisis. During droughts, temple granaries opened for a price. In Mesopotamia, families traded ancestral lands for a month's ration of barley, with contracts stamped by priest scribes. By the time rains returned, the temple owned half the farmland. Even war played into their hands. Victories brought plunder to altar steps, while defeats were blamed on rulers who neglected the gods. Either way, the priesthood grew richer. Yet their ultimate power was making exploitation feel like salvation. When a Babylonian mother handed her last shekel to the temple of Ishtar for her sick child's healing charm, she didn't see extortion, she saw hope. That's how temples outlasted dynasties. They didn't just hold wealth, they sanctified inequality, wrapping greed in divine mandate. By the time kings realized priests were the real puppet masters, it was too late. Their own legitimacy depended on the very men who'd made them kneel. The most terrifying power of the priesthood wasn't just what they claimed to know, it was what they dared to do in full view of the people. Take the Aztec priests of Tenochtitlan, clad in blackened human skin, climbing the steps of the Great Pyramid with a captive warrior's hair gripped in their teeth. The crowd below didn't just watch a ritual, they witnessed a visceral performance designed to paralyze doubt. With one stroke of an obsidian blade, the priest would rip out the victim's still beating heart, holding it aloft as steam rose into the morning sun. This wasn't mere brutality, it was political theater at its most potent. The message was unmistakable. If these men could feed the very sun to keep the cosmos running, what would they do to anyone who challenged their authority? But spectacle alone wasn't enough. The real genius lay in making sacrifice transactional. In ancient Rome, no general would march to war without consulting the augurs, priests who interpreted the will of the gods by watching birds. A few erratic flights over the Capitoline Hill could delay an entire campaign, no matter how ambitious the emperor, and woe to the politician who ignored their verdict. When Julius Caesar famously dismissed an augur's warning about the Ides of March, his fate became a cautionary tale whispered for centuries. The lesson was clear: defy the priesthood, and even the mightiest ruler could fall. The psychological grip tightened through calculated unpredictability. Shang dynasty priests in China practiced scapulomancy, cracking heated animal bones and reading the fractures as divine messages. One splinter out of place might condemn a village to starvation by declaring their harvests unclean. No one could predict which bone would crack how, leaving entire populations in a state of suspended terror. It was the perfect system. The priests weren't just intermediaries with the gods, they were the only ones who could decode their apparent whims. Even more insidious were the healing rituals that blurred the line between salvation and control. Babylonian exorcisms involved elaborate ceremonies where priests battled demons possessing the sick for a fee that often left families destitute. Failed to pay, and suddenly the spirits returned angrier than before. In Egypt, medical papyri full of legitimate remedies were sandwiched between spells only priests could recite correctly. A broken bone might heal, but credit went to the incantation, not the splint. This was power in its purest form. The ability to make people believe their survival depended on your exclusive access to the divine. The darkest brilliance of these rituals, they transformed fear into gratitude. When Carthaginian mothers handed over their infants to be sacrificed during sieges, they did so weeping, but convinced it was the only way to save their city. When Greek oracle priests at Delphi gave cryptic answers that led armies to ruin, the blame fell on misinterpretation, never the temple, and that's what made priestly authority unstoppable. Unlike kings who ruled by force, priests made their subjects beg for the very chains that bound them, all while believing those chains were woven by the gods themselves. Nowhere was this more evident than in their role as healers, a mantle that hid some of history's most ruthless power plays. The same hands that mixed herbal poultices could just as easily poison a rival king's cup, with no one suspecting the holy man who'd blessed it first. The voice that chanted prayers over the sick could also spread plagues by declaring certain wells cursed. And when epidemics struck, guess who emerged wealthier, with desperate crowds donating land and gold for protection? The line between physician and extortionist was terrifyingly thin, and the priesthood walked it with divine precision. In the dim light of a Babylonian healing chamber, a priest pressed a clay amulet to a child's fevered brow, murmuring incantations. Was this medicine or manipulation? The line blurred dangerously. Ancient priests didn't just treat disease, they weaponized it. A Sumerian text describes a man writhing in pain until a priest, diagnosed his illness as the curse of a scorned god. The cure, donating his finest ox to the temple, coincidence or coercion, both. Across early civilizations, healing rituals served a dual purpose, mending bodies while tightening the priesthood's grip on terrified souls. Take the Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical scroll filled with legitimate remedies: willow bark for inflammation, honey for wounds, but buried among them were spells only priests could recite. A broken bone might heal, but credit went to the incantation, not the splint. This was psychological judo. Convince people their survival hinged on your sacred words, and they'd hand over their last copper coin without question. Even plagues became opportunities. When sickness ravaged Hattusa, Hittite priests declared the gods demanded a purification tax paid directly to temple coffers. Desperate citizens complied, never realizing the very men interceding for them controlled the granaries, hoarding the food that could have strengthened their immunity. The darkest power lay in their ability to manufacture divine wrath. A Mesopotamian king's sudden paralysis, not a stroke, a punishment for neglecting temple repairs. A stillborn calf in Mycenae, proof the gods rejected the queen's piety. Priests held monopoly over interpretation, turning random misfortune into damning verdicts. And the cure always involved transferring wealth or power to the priesthood. One Assyrian tablet chillingly records a nobleman's family selling themselves into temple servitude after priests divined that only their lifelong labor could atone for an ancestor's sin. Yet some priests did heal authentically. The same Babylonian temples that exploited fear also pioneered early ophthalmology with detailed records of cataract treatments. But even genuine skill served their authority. When a priest successfully removed a soldier's infected arrowhead, the patient didn't credit sterile tools. He believed the gods had guided the healer's hands. This was the ultimate sleight of hand, wrapping real medical knowledge in enough ritual to make it seem supernatural. By the time a patient recovered, they were less likely to question temple taxes than to donate extra grain in gratitude. Nowhere was this duality more lethal than in warfare. Before battles, Hittite priests performed scorpion rituals, burying clay models of enemies with curses, psychological warfare disguised as religion. When kingdoms clashed, priests didn't just bless troops, they orchestrated omens. A Roman general delaying attack because sacred chickens refused to eat. That wasn't superstition, it was priests flexing geopolitical influence. Lose their support, and suddenly the gods favored your rival. Win their favor, and they'd justify any atrocity as divine will. The Aztecs took this to horrifying extremes, with priests interpreting every military campaign as a mandate to feed the sun with enemy hearts, conquer a city, and its people became sacrificial currency, all sanctified by the very men who stood to gain the most from endless war. This wasn't just spiritual guidance, it was cold calculus. By positioning themselves as the bridge between mortal and divine, priests ensured that whether a kingdom rose or fell, their power remained untouchable. A victorious king showered them with loot. A defeated one, his failure proved he'd ignored their warnings. The lesson echoed across civilizations, cross the priesthood, and you weren't just risking your throne, you were gambling with the gods themselves. Imagine the deck of a Viking longship, the air thick with salt spray, and the muttered prayers of a gaudy priest tracing runes onto warriors' swords. This wasn't just ceremony, it was psychological warfare. Norse raiders didn't just rely on steel. They believed their blades were useless unless consecrated by priests who'd spent nights whispering to Odin. And it worked. When those same warriors charged onto foreign shores, they did so with unshakable certainty that the gods fought beside them. That's how priests turned battlefields into holy ground, where victory depended as much on divine favor as military skill. Take the Hittites, whose priests rode into war alongside chariots, clutching liver models to read the gods will mid-combat. One unfavorable omen, and entire battalions would retreat, even if they were winning. Generals hated it, but disobeying meant risking rebellion from soldiers convinced the gods had abandoned them. Meanwhile, in Egypt, priests didn't just bless Pharaoh's armies, they orchestrated elaborate curses against enemies. Archaeologists found clay figurines of rival kings buried near temples, their limbs twisted, mouths stuffed with wax, a brutal form of spiritual sabotage meant to paralyze foes before the first arrow flew. But the ultimate power play came from the Aztecs. Their war priests didn't just predict outcomes, they manufactured them. Before battle, they'd stage divine signs, releasing eagles at dawn or finding sacred arrows to signal the gods' approval. Lose a skirmish, the priests declared it a test of faith. Win, proof of their unbroken connection to Huitzilopochtli. Either way, the message was clear: without priests, victory was impossible. And when the fighting ended, their roles shifted seamlessly. Captives weren't just prisoners, they were sacrificial offerings, turning military conquest into a sacred duty that fed the priesthood's insatiable ritual calendar. This symbiosis between faith and force reached its peak in ancient Mesopotamia. Assyrian kings, famed for their brutality, still knelt before priests to receive the sacred sword of Asher before campaigns. The weapon itself was ordinary, but the ceremony transformed it into a divine instrument. Soldiers who saw their ruler submit to the priesthood fought harder, believing their cause was sanctified. Conversely, when Babylon fell to the Persians, priests spun the defeat as Marduk's will, ensuring their own survival while the king was led away in chains. Now consider the quieter, deadlier battlefield of justice. Tomorrow we'll see how priests didn't just bless swords, they wrote the laws that decided who lived, who died, and who knelt before the gods with their hands tied. The courtroom in ancient Babylon wasn't filled with lawyers or jurors, just a trembling accused man and a priest holding a glowing bronze rod. This was justice by fire, quite literally. If the burns healed cleanly, the gods declared innocence. If they festered, guilt was sealed. Such trials by ordeal weren't mere superstition. They were the ultimate power play, placing life and death decisions squarely in priestly hands. Across early civilizations, from the banks of the Euphrates to the hills of Judea, priests didn't just advise on divine law, they enforced it with terrifying finality. Take Hammurabi's famous code, etched into an 8-foot stone stele. While the Babylonian king claimed the laws came from the sun god Shamash, it was temple priests who interpreted them. A dispute over stolen grain. The priest decided whether the accused should pay 30-fold or lose a hand. Adultery allegations. Only a priest could administer the river ordeal, where the suspect's survival in swirling currents determined their fate. Kings might write the laws, but priests held the keys to their execution, turning every verdict into a spectacle of divine theater. Even more chilling was the high priest's role in ancient Israel. When disputes reached an impasse, out came the Urim and Thummim, sacred stones said to glow for truth or darken for lies. No witness testimony or evidence could override their verdict. Imagine standing trial with your life hinging on whether a priest declared those stones shining or dim. The psychological genius was undeniable. Challenge a king's judgment and you risked his wrath. Challenge a priest's and you risked the wrath of Yahweh himself. This spiritual judiciary extended to the highest levels of power. In Egypt, before a pharaoh could pass any major decree, priests performed the weighing of the heart ritual, not for the dead but for living lawmakers. A scribe's proposal placed on one scale, a feather of Mat, goddess of truth, on the other. if the scales tipped, the law was unjust and discarded. Who decided if the scales balanced? The same priests who'd earlier adjusted the feather's weight during hidden ceremonies. Even rulers became pawns in this celestial courtroom, where every verdict reinforced the priesthood's unassailable authority. The real mastery lay in making brutality seem benevolent. Norse priests conducting a trial by boiling water framed it as letting the gods judge, but the real message was clearer: resist, and you'd be scalded to the bone before the crowd. Aztec priests testing a thief's guilt by making him walk over hot coals didn't just determine punishment, they made the entire community complicit, cheering if he stumbled. This wasn't justice, it was crowd control disguised as divine intervention, with priests as both directors and lead actors in a play where the script was always rigged in their favor. Yet their most potent role came when crowns changed hands. Tomorrow's revelation shows how priests didn't just interpret divine will, they manufactured it, turning coronations into carefully staged miracles that made kings into gods. And just as easily unmade them. The coronation of an Egyptian pharaoh wasn't just a political event, it was a carefully choreographed miracle. Picture the sacred temple at Karnak, its walls vibrating with the drone of priests chanting as the new ruler knelt before the statue of Ammon. The high priest would place the double crown upon his head, but here's the catch. The statue's arms were rigged to embrace the pharaoh, its mechanical joints hidden in shadow. To the awestruck crowd, it seemed the god himself had chosen this man. This wasn't pageantry, it was psychological alchemy, transforming a mortal into a living god with the priesthood as his divine midwives. In Mesopotamia, the dynamic was even more explicit. The Ensi wasn't just a king, he was a priest king, required to spend nights in the temple's inner sanctum, receiving dreams from the gods. One surviving tablet describes a ruler who dared skip this ritual. Within months, priests declared his city's misfortunes were divine retribution, and he was overthrown by his own generals. The lesson: a crown was just metal without a priest's blessing to sanctify it. But the real power lay in the afterlife narrative. Egyptian funerary texts like the Book of the Dead weren't just spiritual guides, they were cosmic passports, and priests held the stamps. Want your name to live on eternally? You needed the correct spells recited by initiated priests during your burial. One omitted syllable, and your soul might wander the underworld forever. This wasn't just about salvation, it was about control beyond the grave. Wealthy families would pay fortunes to have their ancestors' names recarved on temple walls, ensuring priests kept their memories alive in the gods' records. The Mesopotamians took it further. Their negative confession ritual required the dying to swear before priests that they'd never stolen, lied, or even coveted a neighbor's goat. Fail to arrange this ceremony, and your soul would be devoured by the demoness Lamashtu. But here's the twist: only priests could determine if your confession was sincere. Even in death, you were at their mercy. Perhaps the most brilliant manipulation was the priesthood's monopoly on divine forgiveness. In Hittite rituals, a nobleman's sins could only be absolved by purchasing a substitute deer from the temple, conveniently priced at half his land's value. Assyrian priests sold hell insurance in the form of clay tablets pledging the gods would overlook certain sins. For a yearly fee, this was spiritual capitalism at its finest, with priests as the ultimate brokers of fear and redemption. The chilling truth: kings ruled the living, but priests held the keys to eternity. And nothing motivates obedience like the threat of infinite suffering. When a Babylonian merchant hesitated to donate his warehouse to the temple, priests simply reminded him that the underworld had 7 gates of fire for the stingy. By sunrise, the deed was signed. This wasn't faith, it was celestial blackmail wrapped in incense smoke and holy chants. And it worked for millennia because no army, no treasury, no earthly power could compete with the ultimate weapon, the human terror of divine abandonment. Now consider the scribes who recorded these threats. Tomorrow's revelation uncovers how priests didn't just control access to the gods, they rewrote history itself, erasing rulers and rewriting destinies with the stroke of a reed pen. Deep beneath the pyramids of Egypt, in airless chambers lined with hieroglyphs, priests performed a ritual that could make or break eternity. The opening of the mouth ceremony wasn't just symbolic, it was the ultimate upsell. For the right price, they'd anoint a mummy's lips with a golden blade, magically restoring its senses for the afterlife. Skip this step, the deceased would wander the underworld blind, mute, and starving. This was salvation commodified, with priests holding the monopoly on cosmic safe passage. Families routinely bankrupted themselves funding these rites, selling lands and even indenturing children to secure their loved one's place among the gods. The Vedic priests of ancient India took this further with their elaborate Shraddha ceremonies. For 17 days after a death, mourners were required to feed Brahmins-specific meals, ghee-soaked rice, sesame cakes, milk poured over sacred fires, with each dish priced according to its spiritual potency. Skip a single offering, and ancestors were condemned to wander as hungry ghosts. The priest's brilliance lay in making devotion measurable. More gold meant better karma, turning grief into a quantifiable transaction. One Sanskrit text chillingly lists the exact number of cows needed to purchase a father's assent to higher realms: 16 for a merchant, 24 for a warrior, 32 for a king. Salvation had sliding scale pricing. Rome's College of Pontiffs turned burial into a bureaucratic goldmine. Their Libri Pontificales didn't just dictate funeral rites, they specified which families could bury their dead within city walls, which tombs could display family crests, even how much mourning attire cost. Want your ancestors' urn placed in a prestigious columbarium that required a temple-endorsed permit, renewable annually for a fee? When the wealthy Crassus family tried to bypass these rules, priests declared their tomb polluted, sparking a scandal that forced them to pay triple the usual tribute. The message was clear: even in death you answered to the priesthood. But the true masterpiece of spiritual commerce came from Mesopotamia. The Kispum ritual required families to regularly feed statues of their ancestors, statues only priests could consecrate. Neglect these meals and the dead would curse the living from the underworld. Archaeologists found cuneiform tablets detailing ancestral meal subscriptions, where temples guaranteed regular offerings. For generations of payments, one merchant's contract from stipulates his descendants must keep paying for 500 years. The priesthood had invented the spiritual equivalent of a recurring SaaS model, but instead of software updates, you got protection from zombie ancestors. What made this system unshakable was its emotional leverage. When a Babylonian mother cradled her sick child, priests didn't just sell healing spells, they sold the certainty that without their intervention, the baby's soul might never find peace. Graffiti in Pompeii reveals desperate citizens scribbling loans to pay for last-minute death rites. Even the cynical Roman philosopher Lucian mocked how priests frighten fools with Hades' horrors while emptying their purses. Yet few dared refuse, because wrapped in all that fear was a seductive promise: pay now and eternity becomes negotiable. Behind these public rituals lurked something darker: tightly guarded priestly cabals that controlled access to the divine. Tomorrow's revelation pulls back the curtain on history's most secretive brotherhoods, where initiates drank hallucinogenic brews, performed blood oaths, and manipulated kings from shadowed temples. These weren't just holy men, they were the original power brokers, turning sacred knowledge into the ultimate currency of control. Beneath the grand temples where common priests chanted prayers, far from the public eye, lay the true nerve centers of priestly power, the mystery schools. In Egypt, the House of Life wasn't just a library. It was a vault of forbidden knowledge where initiates studied everything from surgical techniques to celestial mechanics under vows of secrecy. The Greek Eleusinian mysteries went further, with hallucinogenic brews said to transport initiates into the afterlife itself. These weren't holy men reciting scriptures. They were the ancient world's equivalent of elite scientists, their discoveries wrapped in ritual to maintain control. A farmer praying for rain might get a public blessing, but only the innermost circle knew how to predict monsoons using star charts, turning weather into a divine bargaining chip. The hierarchy was deliberate. Outer priests handled day-to-day rituals, keeping the masses compliant with spectacle and superstition. But the true power rested with the adepts who'd survived grueling initiations, nights spent in coffin-like chambers, tests of silence, even simulated drownings in sacred pools. Passing these trials granted access to knowledge that could topple kingdoms. Babylonian astronomer priests, for example, calculated planetary orbits with shocking accuracy, but shared only vague omens with rulers. When a king demanded specifics, they'd cite divine mystery, knowing he couldn't risk angering the scholars who predicted eclipses and harvest cycles. This system of layered secrecy created a priesthood within the priesthood. In India, the Atharva Veda's fire rituals masked early chemistry experiments, with Brahmin alchemists recording metal purification techniques as sacred formulas. Roman augurs publicly tossed animal entrails, but privately maintained detailed migration maps that predicted famine years. The brilliance was in the duality, presenting hard-won knowledge as divine revelation, ensuring no one could replicate it without priestly mediation. Even the famed Library of Alexandria, often hailed as a beacon of open learning, had restricted sections accessible only to temple initiates. The most explosive secrets were reserved for the highest ranks. Egyptian lector priests guarded the Book of Thoth, a text allegedly containing spells to animate statues, a likely coded reference to acoustics or early mechanics. Mesopotamian temple archives held treatises on germ theory, disguised as demon possession cures. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, his generals were baffled to find ziggurat basements stocked with precise anatomical models, their existence unknown even to local nobles. These weren't just spiritual leaders, they were gatekeepers of progress, doling out advancements in ways that reinforced their authority. Nowhere was this control more absolute than with the ultimate priestly weapon language. Sumerian high priests developed cuneiform not just for record-keeping, but as a cryptographic tool. Tax records might be written plainly, but medical texts or astronomical data used layered symbols decipherable only to initiates. The Hindu Sandyabhasa tradition took this further, composing entire scriptures in double-meaning phrases, a farming manual to peasants, a metallurgy guide to the enlightened. This linguistic curtain ensured that even if outsiders accessed sacred texts, they'd miss the true knowledge hidden between the lines. Yet for all their exclusivity, these inner circles weren't just hoarding power, they were preserving it. When invaders sacked cities, it was often priests who safeguarded core knowledge. After the Bronze Age collapse while palaces burned, Egyptian temple scribes hid mathematical papyri in desert caves. Assyrian astrologers fleeing Nineveh's destruction carried cuneiform tablets to remote mountain temples. Their motive wasn't purely altruistic. By becoming the sole custodians of civilization's tools, they guaranteed their own indispensability. A new dynasty might rewrite history, but they'd still need priests to calculate taxes, heal plagues, or read the stars. This hidden web of knowledge reached its pinnacle with priestesses, often overlooked, but in many cultures, the true power behind both temple and throne. While male priests dominated public rituals, women like Egypt's gods, wives of Ammon or Delphi's Pythia, held sway over the most critical decisions, from coronations to wars. Their influence didn't just mirror their male counterparts, it surpassed it, weaving spirituality, politics, and even espionage into a single, unassailable authority. What made these women so formidable wasn't just their connection to the divine. It was their mastery of the ultimate priestly art, making the world believe they spoke for forces beyond mortal comprehension. While kings and high priests dominated the public stage, some of the most formidable power brokers in the ancient world wore veils, not crowns. Take the Pythia of Delphi, perched atop her bronze tripod in the temple's inner sanctum, inhaling hallucinogenic vapors rising from the earth. Her incoherent cries weren't just random ravings, they were carefully passed by temple priests into prophecies that launched fleets and toppled kings. When Croesus asked whether to attack Persia, her famous reply, "If you cross the Halys River, a great empire will fall," seemed like approval. Only after his defeat did the double meaning become clear: the doomed empire was his own. This wasn't fortune-telling. It was geopolitical chess with the Pythia as the ultimate player, her ambiguities allowing Delphi's priests to hedge bets no matter the outcome. Meanwhile, in Rome, the Vestal virgins guarded something more precious than gold, the sacred flame of Vesta. Its extinction signaled doom for the empire, and the penalty for letting it die was burial alive, a fate that befell at least 20 Vestals over the centuries. But their power dwarfed their risks. These women could pardon condemned prisoners with a touch, their persons so inviolable that wills and treaties were stored in their temple for safekeeping. When Julius Caesar's political career hung by a thread, it was a Vestal who handed him secret documents proving his divine lineage, catapulting him to prominence. Their chastity wasn't just piety, it was a strategic barrier ensuring no child could ever challenge their neutrality or their unmatched access to Rome's secrets. In Suma, the high priestess in Hedwana did something unprecedented. She signed her name, the daughter of Sargon the Great. She composed hymns so revolutionary they were still copied centuries after her death. But her poetry wasn't just art, it was propaganda, merging the goddess Inanna's cult with her father's empire. When rebels ousted her from Ur's temple, she penned fiery verses cursing them, and history records their swift downfall. The message was clear: cross a priestess and you didn't just face mortal armies, you risked divine retribution. From Egypt's gods' wives of Ammon, who controlled vast estates and dictated royal succession, to Anatolia's bee priestesses who fermented sacred hallucinogens, these women wielded authority that often eclipsed their male counterparts. A Babylonian priestess could annul contracts with a nod. A Minoan snake goddess interpreter could halt trade routes by declaring omens unfavorable. Their power flowed from the same source as all priesthoods, the monopoly on the unseen. But where male priests relied on spectacle, women often mastered subtler arts: whispered counsel, sacred sexuality, the quiet administration of temple economies that fed cities. The greatest testament to their influence, how desperately later empires tried to erase them. When monotheism swept the Mediterranean, female oracles were silenced first. Vestals were disbanded by Christian emperors, their flame extinguished as pagan superstition. Yet even in decline, they left fingerprints on history, like the way medieval abbesses, inheriting vestiges of this ancient authority, would later challenge popes and kings. Their legacy whispers a truth too often buried: that when we speak of priestly power, we must always listen for the rustle of robes at the edges of the temple, where women once stood as equals in the dance of gods and mortals. The pendulum of power never stays still. As empires rose and fell, the very priesthoods that once made kings tremble would face their own reckoning. What toppled these untouchable figures wasn't just new gods or invaders. It was something far more insidious, lurking in the hearts of the people they'd ruled for millennia. The world of ancient priests, where gods spoke through sacrifices and kings knelt before sacred relics, didn't vanish overnight. It crumbled piece by piece, challenged by empires that no longer trembled at thunderbolts or omens. The first cracks appeared in Rome, where emperors grew weary of sharing power with augurs who could halt wars over a bird's flight pattern. When Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, he didn't just adopt a new god. He dismantled an entire industry of pagan priesthoods, their temples repurposed, their rituals outlawed. Imagine the shock of a Vestal virgin watching soldiers snuff out the sacred flame she'd guarded for decades, its extinction now a symbol of the old order's collapse. Yet the priesthood's decline wasn't just about new religions, it was about skepticism. By the Enlightenment, philosophers like Voltaire mocked oracles as charlatans in linen robes, while scientists debunked eclipses as celestial mechanics, not divine wrath. The French Revolution didn't just guillotine kings, it desecrated cathedrals, turning Notre Dame into a temple of reason. For the first time in millennia, people dared to ask, what if priests weren't intermediaries with the gods, just clever men with a monopoly on fear? But power this ancient doesn't disappear, it adapts. Medieval popes inherited the mantle of divine authority, wielding excommunication like a priest's curse, able to freeze entire kingdoms out of salvation. The divine right of kings was just a rebranded version of Pharaoh's claiming descent from Ammon, with bishops replacing temple scribes as the arbiters of legitimacy. Even the Protestant Reformation, which rejected priestly hierarchies, birthed firebrand preachers who interpreted scripture with the same absolute certainty as any Babylonian oracle. Today's megachurch pastors and televangelists might not sacrifice bulls, but they still trade in redemption for a donation. Politicians seek blessings from rabbis, imams, and swamis before elections, mirroring kings who consulted shamans before battle. The tools have changed, but the game remains. Convince enough people you speak for the divine, and you'll never want for influence. The real question isn't whether priestly power died. It's whether we've just found new names for the same age-old trinity of fear, faith, and control. From the Oracle of Delphi to the algorithms predicting our clicks, humanity still craves intermediaries to decode the unknowable. The robes and rituals evolve, but the hunger for someone to promise or threaten what lies beyond our understanding. That's a force even the mightiest empire can't erase. The echoes of ancient priestly power still reverberate today, though the robes and rituals have changed. Consider the Dalai Lama, whose words carry weight in global diplomacy without a single soldier at his command, much like an Egyptian high priest whose decree could halt a pharaoh's war. Or think of modern megachurch pastors who sway elections, their pulpits morphing into political platforms. The tools have evolved, Twitter threads instead of temple proclamations, live-streamed sermons instead of smoke rising from altar fires. But the core dynamic remains. Blend moral authority with mass influence, and you wield a force more potent than any army. What's fascinating is how these modern figures navigate the same tightrope as their ancient counterparts. The Vatican's diplomatic corps still negotiates with world leaders, much like Hittite priests brokered treaties under the guise of divine mediation. Televangelists fundraise with promises of miracles, echoing Babylonian priests who sold hell insurance on clay tablets. Even the backlash feels familiar. When scandals rock modern religious leaders, the public outcry mirrors ancient texts condemning corrupt temple officials for diverting sacrificial lambs to their kitchens. The script hasn't changed, only the stage has, yet there's a crucial difference. Ancient priests held monopolies on literacy, medicine, even the calendar. Today, information is democratized. Anyone can Google eclipse predictions or download sacred texts. But here's the twist. In an age of information overload, people still crave interpreters. Podcasters dissect scripture with the same authority as Mesopotamian diviners reading livers. Conspiracy theorists weave modern myths as elaborate as any priestly prophecy. The hunger for someone to make sense of chaos is timeless. This brings us to the myths surrounding ancient priesthoods, starting with the biggest misconception of all, that they were purely spiritual figures. The truth, they were masterful politicians. When archaeologists unearthed the archive of Mari, they found letters showing priests spying on rivals and reporting to kings like intelligence operatives. The Oracle of Delphi didn't just predict futures, she influenced foreign policy, her ambiguous answers allowing Greek city-states to claim divine backing for whatever they'd already decided to do. Spirituality was the veneer, realpolitik was the engine. Another myth, that priestly power was unchallenged. Scrolls from Amarna reveal how Egyptian priests sabotaged Pharaoh Akhenaten's monotheistic revolution by spreading rumors of plagues sent by the old gods. In Rome, emperors like Augustus gradually absorbed priestly titles into their own personas, cutting out the middlemen between mortals and the divine. Even the famed, unchanging traditions of priesthoods were often reinvented, like the Babylonian New Year ritual, which historians now know was rewritten at least 3 times to suit different dynasties. The most persistent myth, though, is that these systems relied solely on fear. Yes, the threat of divine wrath kept many in line, but ancient priesthoods also offered tangible benefits: medical care, disaster relief, even entertainment. Mesopotamian temples distributed grain during famines. Egyptian priests ran the earliest known hospitals. People didn't just obey out of terror, they did so because the priesthood, for all its exploitation, often functioned as the closest thing to a social safety net. Remove that utility, as the Roman Empire did when it secularized grain distribution, and priestly influence waned. So what's the takeaway? Ancient priests weren't just robed mystics, they were CEOs, spin doctors, and power brokers rolled into one. Their modern counterparts inherit that legacy, navigating the same tensions between faith and control. The next time you see a viral sermon or a religious leader trending on Twitter, look past the screen. You're witnessing the latest chapter in humanity's oldest play, the endless dance between the sacred and the strategic. Hollywood loves painting ancient priests as either sinister puppet masters or saintly hermits, but reality was far more complex. Take the Library of Alexandria while films show fanatics burning scrolls. The truth is, priests like the scholar Hypatia were among its greatest defenders, preserving mathematics and astronomy even as empires crumbled. Or consider medieval Irish monks copying not just scriptures but pagan poetry by candlelight, ensuring Beowulf and the Odyssey survived the Dark Ages. These weren't power-hungry schemers, they were humanists in robes, bridging the gap between antiquity and the Renaissance. Then there's the Buddhist tradition, where monks like Bodhidharma famously turned down emperors' invitations to court, choosing mountain caves over palaces. In Tibet, the Dalai Lama's Gelug monks still take vows of poverty, their influence stemming from spiritual authority, not armies or coffers. Even in ancient Egypt, where priesthoods wielded immense power, some like the physician-priest Imhotep pioneered medicine, leaving behind detailed surgical manuals, proof that sacred roles could coexist with genuine progress. Yet for every scholar-priest, there were others who blurred the line between faith and fraud. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece promised enlightenment to initiates, but whispers persisted about priests spiking sacred wine with hallucinogens to manufacture divine visions. Roman augurs faced satire for interpreting bird flights to suit their patron's agendas. Cicero even quipped that two augurs couldn't meet without laughing at the system they perpetuated. This duality, altruism alongside opportunism, defined priesthoods across cultures. The real scandal, how often these tensions exploded into outright corruption. Tomorrow's revelations dive into history's most shocking priestly downfalls, from Babylon's embezzling temple accountants to Renaissance popes who auctioned salvation like market vendors. But here's the twist. Even the worst offenders often justified their crimes as holy necessities, proving that when humans play middlemen to the divine, the line between piety and profiteering can vanish altogether. Scandals ripped through sacred halls as often as prayers echoed off temple walls, perhaps because power built on divine authority tempts even the holiest hands. Take the Oracle of Delphi, whose prophecies once swayed empires. By the 4th century BCE, visitors whispered that her trances came not from Apollo's fumes, but from bags of gold slipped to priests behind the curtain. One surviving account describes a Spartan diplomat caught red-handed, his bribe buying a prophecy urging war against Athens. When the scheme unraveled, so did Delphi's credibility, proving that even the mightiest spiritual institutions could crumble under the weight of greed. The medieval church's indulgence trade turned salvation into a spreadsheet. Priests in the 15th century sold handwritten receipts promising reduced time in purgatory, with bulk discounts for wealthy families. A German bishop even marketed indulgences as afterlife insurance, claiming they could cover future sins not yet committed. The backlash ignited Luther's Reformation, but the real scandal was how blatantly the system monetized fear. Peasants who couldn't afford a single indulgence watched bankers buy them by the dozen, exposing a celestial pay-to-win scheme dressed in holy vestments. Yet for every fallen priest, there were those who weaponized their roles too cleverly to get caught. Babylon's high priests maintained a lucrative sideline in dream interpretation. For a fee, they'd discover divine messages urging debtors to repay loans to temple coffers. Egyptian lector priests allegedly rigged statues of gods to speak during trials, their hidden tubes funneling verdicts that always favored the highest bidder. These weren't just breaches of trust, they were cracks in the very foundation of societies where priests functioned as both judiciary and jury. What's striking isn't that these scandals happened, it's how they barely dented priestly influence. When Rome's Vestal virgins were caught in a late-night orgy with aristocrats, the ensuing trial focused more on the men's sacrilege than the priestesses' broken vows. Even disgraced priests often reinvented themselves. One Babylonian temple accountant, caught embezzling silver, simply relocated to a rival city and became their chief financial advisor. The lesson was clear: challenge a king and you risked execution, challenge a priest and you risked the wrath of the gods, or worse, the believers who still trusted them. Their true legacy, however, outlasted even the most explosive scandals. The same hands that counted illicit silver also designed temples that defined civilizations. From Delphi's terraces to Karnak's towering columns, priest architects encoded sacred knowledge into stone alignments that tracked solstices and eclipses. A disgraced oracle might fade into history, but the walls she once whispered within still stand testaments to the duality of priestly power. For all their moral failings, these were also the visionaries who built humanity's first universities, hospitals, and libraries. Perhaps that's the ultimate irony. The same institutions that hoarded power also preserved the light of progress, leaving behind not just tales of corruption, but blueprints for cathedrals still inspiring awe centuries later. Towering ziggurats didn't just scrape the Mesopotamian sky, they carved priestly authority into the landscape itself. Every mud brick tier shouted a silent message: those who controlled the gods controlled the horizon. Unlike royal palaces, which existed to glorify mortal rulers, these stepped monuments were designed as literal stairways to heaven, their heights accessible only to priests performing rituals no commoner could witness. The effect was psychological genius. By keeping the most sacred spaces physically out of reach, priesthoods made divine power feel both awe-inspiring and untouchable. Egypt's pyramids took this concept to staggering extremes. While pharaohs got the credit, it was priest architects who dictated every sacred angle and alignment. The Great Pyramid's corridors don't just point north, they encode celestial knowledge so precise that even modern astronomers marvel. But here's what guidebooks don't mention. Those same passageways were booby-trapped with hidden chambers and false doors, ensuring only initiated priests could navigate them safely. This wasn't just architecture, it was a security system protecting priestly secrets behind tons of limestone. Gothic cathedrals continued the tradition centuries later. Those vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows, they weren't merely beautiful, they were theological propaganda in colored light. Chartres Cathedral's labyrinth floor pattern didn't just symbolize spiritual journeys, it physically forced pilgrims to walk a path designed by priests, literally following their prescribed route to enlightenment. Even the gargoyles served a purpose beyond decoration. Their grotesque faces reminded visitors that evil lurked outside church walls, reinforcing the priesthood's role as humanity's protectors. The real power move came in controlling construction itself. Sumerian temple projects employed thousands, from bricklayers to scribes, creating entire economies dependent on priestly patronage. Workers weren't just paid in grain, they earned credit toward divine favor, their labor framed as service to the gods. This turned monumental building into a sacred duty, where protesting working conditions risked spiritual consequences. When the Aztecs expanded the Templo Mayor, they didn't need slave drivers. They had something stronger: belief that carrying stones pleased Huitzilopochtli. Artistic expression became another priestly tool. In Assyria, temple reliefs depicted kings kneeling before priests, a visual reminder of where true authority lay. Egyptian tomb paintings showed pharaohs making offerings to deities, but always with a priest standing just behind, hands raised in blessing, positioning themselves as the indispensable middlemen. Even the colors held meaning. Maya blue pigment, used exclusively for priestly garments and temple murals, was chemically engineered to outlast other dyes, making sacred art literally more enduring than secular works. Music and performance amplified this cultural dominance. Mesopotamian hymns weren't just worship, they were copyright-protected priestly property, with scribes recording composer credits on cuneiform tablets. The Hindu Vedas were passed down through generations via exacting oral traditions. Mispronouncing a single syllable was believed to invite disaster, ensuring only trained Brahmins could correctly transmit sacred knowledge. Greek temple dramas blended myth and politics, with priest playwrights like Sophocles subtly justifying Athenian imperialism as divine will. Perhaps the most insidious control lay in controlling time itself. Babylonian priests developed the 7-day week not for practicality, but to enforce temple schedules. Sabbath observance began as their way to mark days when markets closed for rituals. Egyptian hieroglyphs didn't just record history, they curated it, with priest scribes selectively erasing unpopular pharaohs from temple walls like ancient censors. When Christianity spread, it wasn't just converting souls, it was overwriting local calendars, replacing pagan festivals with saints' days under the supervision of bishop chroniclers. What emerges isn't just a story of spiritual guidance, but of cultural engineering. Every fresco, every hymn, every carved column served a dual purpose: to glorify the gods while quietly reinforcing the idea that without priests, civilization itself would crumble. Their true masterpiece wasn't any single temple. It was convincing humanity that beauty, knowledge, and tradition flowed solely through their consecrated hands. Walking through an ancient Mayan temple, your eyes would have been bombarded with vibrant murals, not just art, but carefully crafted propaganda. One famous fresco at Bonampak shows a local king bowing before a high priest, the holy man's hands raised to the heavens as if channeling divine approval directly onto the ruler's crown. This wasn't decoration, it was a billboard advertising priestly supremacy, stamped onto walls where no one could ignore it. Across civilizations, priests didn't just create art, they weaponized it, turning pigments and stone into tools of psychological control. In Egypt, hieroglyphs were more than writing, they were sacred technology. Carved into temple walls, they didn't merely describe rituals, they were believed to activate them. A priest's chisel didn't just etch words, it allegedly unleashed spells with every stroke. The Rosetta Stone might be a linguistic key today, but in its time it was a priestly decree, its triple language text ensuring both gods and mortals understood who held the keys to cosmic order. Even the colors had coded meanings: lapis blue for divinity, gold for eternity, red for chaos, each hue a visual catechism reinforcing hierarchy. Christianity's stained glass windows continued this tradition centuries later. Gazing up at Chartres Cathedral's kaleidoscopic scenes, medieval peasants saw Bible stories filtered through priestly lenses literally. The glass didn't just depict heaven, it controlled how heaven was imagined, with light itself manipulated to dazzle and humble. Notice how apostles always look toward clerics in these designs, subtly positioning priests as the living links to sanctity. Gothic cathedrals were less buildings and more three-dimensional propaganda, their very architecture whispering, "Submit to the holy chain of command." The Aztecs took visual indoctrination further with their tlacuilos, priest artists who painted codices. These weren't neutral histories but curated narratives where military victories became divine mandates and defeated enemies were drawn contorted in humiliation. One surviving codex shows the conquest of Tlatelolco, not as a brutal land grab but as a sacred event, with priestly blessings hovering over the battlefield like speech bubbles from the gods. Defeated warriors are depicted with their mouths agape, not in pain but in awe of their conqueror's righteousness. But the real masterstroke was controlling collective memory through selective artistry. Assyrian palace reliefs meticulously recorded battles except when they didn't. Archaeologists found chisel marks where certain defeats were literally scraped from the stone, replaced by invented triumphs. Egyptian pharaohs like Hatshepsut suffered similar fates. Her monuments were defaced not by invaders but by later priests rewriting history to suit new dynasties. This wasn't censorship, it was sacred editing, with priests acting as the ultimate curators of what deserved to be remembered. Even music and dance became tools of ideological enforcement. In India, Bharatanatyam wasn't just temple dancing. It was physical storytelling where every mudra hand gesture encoded Vedic philosophy. Performances weren't entertainment but theological lessons, with priests ensuring the movements perfectly mirrored sacred text. Similarly, Gregorian chant in medieval Europe wasn't merely melodic. Its hypnotic, unison structure discouraged individual thought, reinforcing communal submission. The rhythms weren't random. They mirrored Latin syntax, subtly training ears to associate priestly speech patterns with divine harmony. Nowhere was this cultural engineering more overt than in priestly control of education. Tomorrow's revelations uncover how temple schools didn't just teach reading, they weaponized literacy, turning knowledge into a sacrament only the initiated could legally possess. From cuneiform tablets to illuminated manuscripts, the pattern repeats. Whoever controls the script controls reality itself. Deep within the temple complexes of ancient Mesopotamia, young scribes hunched over clay tablets, their reed styluses etching the world's first lessons into damp earth. This wasn't just education, it was initiation into a priestly caste that controlled the very fabric of civilization. The Adaba, or tablet house, functioned as part classroom, part indoctrination center, where sons of elites memorized cuneiform signs by day and copied hymns to Enlil by night. A single misplaced wedge could mean hours of recopying under the watchful eye of the Amir, the priest-teacher who wielded his reed like a scepter of knowledge. Graduates didn't just leave literate, they emerged as scribes sworn to temple service, their loyalty cemented through years of ritual and repetition. India's Gurukul system took this further, blending pedagogy with devotion. Students didn't just study the Vedas, they lived them, rising before dawn to chant mantras in forests where every rustling leaf was framed as a divine lesson. Memorization wasn't rote learning but sacred preservation, with Brahmin teachers insisting the slightest mispronunciation could corrupt cosmic order. The Chandogya Upanishad recounts how a pupil spent 12 years mastering a single hymn, his guru withholding deeper knowledge until his voice mirrored the sound of the universe. This was education as alchemy, transforming young minds into living vessels of tradition. Egypt's House of Life reveals the darker edge of this monopoly. Medical students didn't just learn anatomy, they copied spells from the Brooklyn Papyrus, where remedies for scorpion bites sat beside incantations to drive out demons. A broken bone might require setting, but only after reciting the proper charm to knit flesh like numb molding clay. The genius was in the linkage, cure a patient with herbs, and credit went to Thoth. Fail and the priest could blame insufficient piety, ensuring no one questioned the system. The Maya turned priestly schools into intellectual fortresses. At Capon's Scribble Academy, nobles learned to calculate Venus cycles with jaw-dropping precision, but only after swearing oaths to never share the math with commoners. Their codices didn't just record history, they weaponized it, with priest astronomers backdating events to prove current rulers fulfilled ancient prophecies. When Spanish bishops later burned these texts, they weren't just destroying books, they were erasing the encryption keys to a priestly power grid centuries in the making. What emerges isn't a story of benign scholarship, but of carefully curated enlightenment. Sumerian temple libraries held treatises on irrigation and law, yet access required priestly approval. The famed Library of Alexandria, often romanticized as a beacon of open learning, restricted its inner shelves to initiates of the museum, a temple in all but name. Even the Hippocratic Oath began as a priestly compact, its original text invoking Apollo the healer before listing medical ethics. This was knowledge wrapped in sacrament, ensuring that every advance in logic or medicine came stamped with divine approval. The real surprise, how much authentic discovery thrived within these controlled systems. Babylonian priest astronomers mapped Jupiter's movements with error margins smaller than medieval Europe's. Egyptian temple chemists developed metallurgy techniques so advanced they could plate statues with molecular thin gold leaf. But these breakthroughs were never shared as pure science, always as divine gifts, their utility inseparable from the priesthood's mystique. When Archimedes reportedly set Roman ships ablaze with mirrors, he channeled centuries of temple optics knowledge repackaged as miracle. Perhaps no invention better captures this duality than the Antikythera mechanism. Recovered from a shipwreck off Greece, this 2nd century BC computer used precise gears to predict eclipses and track Olympic cycles. Recent scans reveal inscriptions linking its functions to temple rituals, proof that even humanity's first analog computer may have been less a tool of progress than a priestly prop for awing crowds. The pattern repeats across civilizations. Innovation flourished under priestly patronage, but only when it reinforced their role as sole interpreters of the cosmos. Nowhere was this balance more delicate than in medicine, where healing and heresy danced a razor's edge. Tomorrow's revelations uncover how priest doctors from Babylon to Tibet pioneered surgery and vaccines while ensuring every cure came with a price tag visible only to the gods. High above the jungles of Capon, Mayan priest astronomers tracked Venus with a precision that still stuns modern scientists. Their observatories weren't just towers, they were celestial calculators, their staircases aligned to catch the planet's first gleam over the horizon after months of absence. But here's what temple carvings don't advertise. Those same priests who charted the stars also dictated when to go to war based on their readings. A harmonious alignment might greenlight a raid, while an eclipse could halt an empire's expansion. This wasn't just science, it was celestial geopolitics, where the movements of heavenly bodies became excuses for earthly power grabs. Meanwhile, in China's mist-shrouded mountains, Taoist alchemists stirred cauldrons of cinnabar and mercury, seeking elixirs of immortality. Their experiments with minerals and metals weren't mere superstition, they were early chemistry, yielding discoveries like gunpowder and porcelain glaze. Yet every breakthrough came wrapped in ritual. A successful distillation wasn't credited to careful measurements, but to aligning with the Tao's cosmic flow. When an emperor died from drinking a golden immortality potion, likely liquid mercury poisoning, the alchemists didn't face blame. They simply declared his spirit had ascended to the heavens. The Babylonian astronomers of the Enuma Anu Enlil tablets took this duality further. They compiled centuries of eclipse records into precise predictive tables, yet presented each calculation as a divine omen. A king might receive a warning like, if the moon eclipses on the 15th day, the ruler of Elam will fall sick. The genius, these predictions were vague enough to guarantee partial hits, allowing priests to claim credit for victories while blaming failures on misinterpreted signs. Their clay tablets reveal the birth of astrology as a political tool, where star charts became celestial press releases justifying royal decrees. But what happened when someone dared question this cosmic authority? Dissenters faced more than skepticism. They risked being labeled heretics or worse. In Mesopotamia, a scribe who suggested eclipses followed predictable cycles rather than divine whims could find himself reassigned to counting grain sacks in some remote warehouse. The Aztecs had a grislier solution. Astronomers who challenged official interpretations might wind up on the sacrificial stone, their still-beating hearts offered to the sun god as correction for doubting priestly wisdom. Yet cracks in the system appeared. Greek thinkers like Aristarchus proposed heliocentric models despite temple opposition, while in India, Jainist scholars quietly preserved alternate cosmologies in underground libraries. The real turning point came when priests themselves began splitting ranks like the Reformation-era astronomers who used church Latin to debate Copernican theory, hiding radical math in pious terminology. This tension between revelation and observation would eventually explode into the scientific revolution, but not before centuries of priest scientists walked a razor's edge. advancing knowledge while ensuring it never fully escaped the shadow of the sacred. The irony, those same temple libraries that hoarded knowledge also preserved it. When the Library of Alexandria burned, it was monastic scribes who salvaged fragments of pagan astronomy alongside psalters. Mayan codices destroyed by Spanish friars survived because a single priest astronomer hid them beneath church floorboards. Even Isaac Newton, the archetype of modern science, spent more years decoding biblical prophecies than formulating laws of motion. The line between mystic and mathematician was always thinner than we pretend, a truth that still echoes in how society wrestles with experts who claim authority over life's biggest questions. Questioning a priest wasn't just dissent, it was cosmic treason. When Socrates sipped hemlock in Athens, his crime wasn't merely corrupting youth. He dared to suggest truth could be found through reason rather than temple oracles. Centuries later, the Spanish Inquisition's hooded figures used iron implements not just to break bones, but to shatter any worldview that threatened priestly monopolies on truth. Even the Aztecs, masters of celestial calculation, reserved their most gruesome executions for those who mocked the sacred, flaying the skin from living skeptics to fashion ritual masks, a visceral warning against doubt. The brilliance of these systems lay in their self-perpetuating terror. Medieval Europe's witch trials didn't require actual witchcraft to sustain their power, just the whispered accusation from a sanctioned cleric. A single rumor of heresy could turn neighbors into informants, as seen when French villages denounced thousands during the Cathar Purge. The accused faced impossible choices: confess to imaginary crimes and be pardoned, or maintain innocence and burn. Either outcome reinforced priestly authority, proving their divine mandate to root out evil. Language itself became a weapon in this ideological war. The Vatican's Index of Forbidden Books wasn't just censorship. It was a calculated strike against vernacular translations that might let laypeople interpret scripture without priestly mediation. When Jan Hus advocated for Czech-language Bibles in 15th century Prague, his reward was being burned at the stake with pages from the offending text stuffed into his pyre. The message was clear: access to divine knowledge required priestly gatekeepers, but the most insidious suppression targeted not rebels but innovators. Hypatia of Alexandria, a mathematician who improved astrolabes and challenged geocentric dogma, was torn apart by a Christian mob incited by Bishop Cyril. Mayan astronomers who predicted eclipses too accurately risked being branded as sorcerers, their celestial models destroyed as dangerous knowledge. Even in tolerant Indus Valley cities, healers using non-temple, approved remedies found themselves suddenly accused of angering the gods during outbreaks. This systematic crushing of dissent had a chilling effect on progress. The Roman Empire's decline in scientific advancement coincided with Christian authorities labeling Greek experimental methods as pagan vanity. Persian alchemists working in optics and chemistry hid their findings in coded Sufi poetry to avoid charges of heresy. The pattern repeated globally. Any breakthrough not blessed by priesthoods was recast as hubris, its creators silenced or erased. Yet the greatest tool for control wasn't the stake or the rack, it was the sacred word itself. Tomorrow's revelation exposes how priestly languages like Latin, Sanskrit, and hieratic weren't just holy tongues, but cryptographic tools designed to keep knowledge locked away from the masses. A single mistranslated syllable could mean the difference between salvation and damnation, and the priests held all the dictionaries. Dead tongues held more sway than living ones in the halls of power. Picture a medieval peasant kneeling in a cathedral, the priest's Latin mass rolling over him like thunder, beautiful, terrifying, and utterly incomprehensible. This wasn't just prayer, it was a linguistic moat separating the sacred from the profane. Latin, Sanskrit, Coptic, these ancient languages didn't fade into obscurity. They were deliberately preserved like ritual artifacts, polished and wielded by priesthoods to gatekeep divine access. To speak the holy tongue was to hold the keys to law, medicine, and even the afterlife itself. The Vatican's insistence on Latin masses until the 1960s wasn't tradition. It was a 1,000-year-old power play, ensuring only the initiated could mediate between heaven and earth. Sanskrit's survival is even more striking. Long after it vanished from Indian marketplaces, it thrived in temple courtyards, where Brahmin priests recited Vedas with phonetics so precise they could freeze a novice's tongue. The Rigveda's hymns weren't just memorized, they were passed down with exacting oral traditions, where a mispronounced syllable was believed to invite cosmic disaster. This wasn't linguistic preservation, it was intellectual apartheid. By monopolizing Sanskrit, priests ensured that legal codes, medical treatises, and royal decrees all flowed through their hands. A king might rule, but only the Brahmin could sanctify his coronation with the correct mantra. The genius lay in framing exclusivity as reverence. When Egyptian priests chanted in hieratic, a script so arcane even most scribes couldn't read it, they didn't call it secrecy, they called it sacred mystery. The Mayans took this further, developing a writing system so complex that only a dozen nobles in each city-state were literate. Their glyphs didn't just record history, they weaponized it, with priest scribes retroactively editing conquests to fit divine prophecies. A defeated ruler's name could vanish from stelae overnight, erased as if the gods themselves had disowned him, but the real power of these dead languages. They shaped reality itself. In medieval Europe, a Latin-speaking priest could declare a couple married, a child legitimate, or a will valid, while the illiterate masses nodded along, trusting the sounds if not the meaning. Babylonian exorcisms required Akkadian incantations. Mispronounce one word and the demon might stay put. The Aztecs believed Nahuatl poetry could literally bend time, with priests reciting verses to hold the sun in place during eclipses. Language wasn't just communication, it was cosmic engineering, and priests held the blueprints. Nowhere was this control more personal than in gender roles. Tomorrow's revelation uncovers how priestly language didn't just exclude the masses, it silenced women entirely. From banned Sanskrit study to Latin liturgies that framed Eve's sin as eternal justification for male-only pulpits. The holiest words were often the sharpest weapons. Consider the fate of a Vestal virgin in ancient Rome. Her body wasn't her own, but a living vessel for the city's sacred flame. If the fire died, so might her life, buried alive in an underground chamber as punishment. This wasn't just religious devotion, it was social engineering at its most calculated. Across civilizations, priests didn't merely interpret divine will, they designed the very fabric of daily life, weaving gender roles into sacred law with threads of ritual and terror. In India, the sati ritual turned widowhood into a pyre, framing self-immolation as the ultimate act of marital piety. Babylonian priestesses underwent sacred marriage rites with kings, their bodies becoming the literal conduit between heaven and earthly power. These weren't spiritual choices, they were systems of control disguised as destiny. The mechanisms were often deceptively simple. Egyptian fertility rites required women to bare their bodies before statues of Hathor, while priests anointed them with oils blessed by the gods. The message was clear: reproduction wasn't private, it was temple business. Greek oracle priestesses like the Pythia at Delphi had to remain celibate, their virginity framed as a conduit for Apollo's voice. Yet male priests faced no such restrictions, freely marrying and fathering children. This double standard wasn't incidental. it ensured priestly lineages controlled both sacred knowledge and bloodlines. Marriage itself became a priestly battleground. In Mesopotamia, temple prostitutes known as nadatu lived cloistered lives, their sexual encounters ritualized as divine service. Hindu Brahmins dictated that a widow's shaved head and white robes marked her as inauspicious, banishing her from celebrations. Even childbirth wasn't exempt. Aztec midwives recited spells attributing labor pains to the goddess Tlazolteotl, turning maternal suffering into theological theater. Every stage of a woman's existence, from menarche to menopause, was choreographed by holy decrees that reinforced male authority. But the true power lay in framing oppression as honor. When Spartan brides had their heads shaved by priestesses before marriage, it was called a purification. Celtic druids taught that women who died in childbirth gained instant passage to the other world, a glamorized gloss on high mortality rates. The brilliance was psychological. Convince someone their chains are laurels and they'll polish them themselves. Now imagine the chaos when nature itself rebelled. Floods, plagues, and famines didn't just test societies, they revealed priesthoods at their most ruthless, ready to sacrifice anything or anyone to restore divine order. When disaster struck in the ancient world, whether the Nile failed to flood or locusts blackened the sky, the first sound people heard wasn't the wailing of mourners, but the rhythmic chants of priests invoking divine mercy. These weren't just prayers, they were carefully staged demonstrations of priestly indispensability. In Mesopotamia, when the Euphrates burst its banks, temple officials didn't just perform rituals, they orchestrated public spectacles of atonement, parading statues of gods through ruined neighborhoods while whispering that the king's impiety had provoked the deluge. The message was unmistakable. Nature's fury was divine displeasure, and only the priesthood could negotiate the ceasefire. The Tang dynasty perfected this celestial blame game with the mandate of heaven doctrine. A famine wasn't just bad harvests, it was cosmic report card signaling the emperor's moral failure. Rebellions that followed weren't treason, they were divinely sanctioned corrections. In one brutal example from the 9th century, when drought sparked cannibalism in Henan province, Buddhist monks distributed gruel from temple storehouses while circulating prophecies that the Tang had lost heaven's favor. Within months, peasant armies marched under yellow banners, their revolt blessed by monastic leaders who stood ready to anoint whatever warlord emerged victorious. But the real power lay in the aftermath. After calamity passed, priests didn't just rebuild temples, they rewrote history. Egyptian stelae from the reign of Pepi Roman II attribute the Nile's return to priestly interventions, omitting mentions of royal irrigation projects. Aztec codices frame the Great Famine of 1454 as the god Tlaloc's punishment for Montezuma's pride, glossing over the drought's ecological causes. These narratives transformed random disasters into moral object lessons, reinforcing priestly authority as the only bulwark against chaos. The industrial age would eventually unravel this ancient compact between the sacred and the desperate, but not before priests staged one final, breathtaking act of crisis theater. When cholera ravaged 19th century London, Anglican clerics initially blamed the poor for moral filth rather than contaminated water. Their sermons drew crowds even as doctors mapped sewer lines, the old guard clinging to divinity's explanatory power even as science pride opened their monopoly on truth. What followed wasn't just the decline of priestly influence, but the birth of a new world where hurricanes had meteorological explanations, and where kings no longer fell because priests declared the gods angry. The thunder of steam engines didn't just drown out temple bells, it shattered an ancient balance of power. Imagine a London factory worker in 1850, his face smeared with soot as he clocks into a 12-hour shift. The rhythms of his life no longer follow harvest festivals or sacred holidays, but the relentless whistle of the foreman. Where priests once dictated when to sow or reap, now efficiency experts like Frederick Taylor measured every motion with stopwatches. Cathedrals still towered over skylines, but the real pilgrimage sites were the roaring mills of Manchester and Pittsburgh, where smokestacks became the new spires and production quotas the new liturgy. Science delivered the final blow to priestly prestige. When cholera outbreaks struck, doctors traced contagion to water pumps, not divine wrath. Astronomers proved comets followed predictable paths, stripping them of their omen-laden terror. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species didn't just challenge Genesis, it demolished the priesthood's monopoly on humanity's origin story. The same clerics who once interpreted eclipses now found themselves debating geology professors in town halls, their authority crumbling like poorly fired bricks. Yet Nietzsche's warning proved prophetic. Killing God didn't erase the God-shaped hole in society. The rituals simply migrated. Victorian seances replaced confessionals, with mediums channeling spirits instead of saints. The Crystal Palace's Great Exhibition of 1851 became a cathedral of progress, its glass arches shimmering with the same awe once reserved for stained glass windows. Even the factory floor developed its own sacraments, time clocks, punch cards, and the sacred tea break, all overseen by a new class of managerial priests in waistcoats rather than vestments. Today's temples glow with LCD light. Tech campuses like Silicon Valley's Googleplex mirror monastic compounds, complete with communal living and free meals to keep devotees on site. Steve Jobs' black turtleneck became the new clerical robe. His product launches sermons promising transcendence through the next iPhone. Social media influencers, armed with algorithms instead of holy texts, offer salvation through self-optimization. Follow these 10 steps, and the algorithm shall deliver you from obscurity. The language itself betrays the inheritance. We worship celebrities, have faith in cryptocurrencies, and describe viral posts as blessed. The lesson: power never vanishes, it just changes vestments. Ancient priests controlled grain stores. Today's tech overlords hoard data. Where Babylonian scribes guarded cuneiform, now programmers encrypt source code. The mechanisms differ, but the game remains. Convince enough people you hold the keys to their survival, whether spiritual or digital, and you'll always find them kneeling. Lessons from these ancient priest kings ripple through time, revealing a pattern as old as civilization itself. The fusion of belief and control still shapes our world today. Think about modern politicians who invoke divine blessings during speeches, or media figures who frame their opinions as moral crusades. The script hasn't changed, only the stage has. When a televangelist declares a hurricane divine punishment or a tech CEO promises salvation through algorithms, they're channeling the same primal instinct that made Mesopotamian priests indispensable: the human craving for intermediaries to decode life's chaos. Consider how fear operates in contemporary systems. Ancient priests warned of droughts and plagues. Today, headlines scream about climate catastrophe or economic collapse, often framed by voices claiming exclusive solutions. The Babylonian priest selling hell insurance finds his counterpart in modern influencers peddling financial salvation through cryptic subscriptions. What both share is the exploitation of uncertainty, transforming anxiety into allegiance with the promise of protection, whether from eternal damnation or a crashing stock market. Yet the most potent legacy lies in the priesthood's mastery of narrative control. Egyptian scribes erased pharaohs from history. Today, social media algorithms quietly bury inconvenient truths while amplifying curated realities. The Maya's Venus-based war prophecies find eerie echoes in data-driven election forecasts, where statistical models wield near mystical authority. When a government cites national security to justify secrecy or a corporation brands dissent as misinformation, they're employing the oldest trick in the book, positioning themselves as the sole interpreters of truth, much like priests deciphering animal entrails. This isn't cynicism, it's clarity. Recognizing these patterns arms us against manipulation. When a leader claims the gods demand sacrifice, or its modern equivalent, there's no alternative. We can ask who benefits from this inevitability. Ancient priests hoarded grain during famines. Today's power brokers monopolize data, the new currency of survival. The stakes feel different, but the game remains unchanged. So why does this dusty history matter now? Because understanding the priest-king dynamic is the ultimate antidote to blind obedience. When we see a celebrity's cult-like following or a politician's messianic rhetoric, we're no longer awestruck spectators. We're archaeologists recognizing familiar ruins. The temples may be glass skyscrapers now, the sacrifices quarterly earnings instead of oxen, but the human psychology they exploit hasn't evolved. Knowledge of this game won't dismantle it, but it lets us choose when to kneel and when to walk away. The final lesson is one the ancients never intended. Power persists not through force, but through stories. Those who craft the most compelling narratives, whether etched in cuneiform or coded in pixels, don't just rule. They define reality itself. Our task to read between the lines as only the initiated once could. From the smoke-filled temples of ancient Sumer to the vaulted halls of the Vatican, one thread weaves through history unchanged. Where belief and authority intertwine, power takes root and flourishes. Kings rise and fall, their swords rusting in forgotten tombs, but the scribe's stylus and the priest's chant echo across millennia. Today, the robes may look different: sharp suits instead of linen vestments, TD talk stages instead of stone altars, but the playbook remains eerily familiar. Tech gurus preach the gospel of disruption with evangelical fervor. Algorithms decide our fates like digital oracles, and influencers peddle salvation through self-optimization. The vocabulary has changed, but the grammar of control is the same. Consider how modern institutions mirror ancient priestly tactics. Silicon Valley's disciples hoard data like temple scribes guarded cuneiform, framing their monopolies as sacred missions to connect the world. Politicians invoke moral absolutes with the same solemnity as Babylonian priests reading entrails, turning policy debates into holy wars. Even the language we use betrays this legacy. Brands speak of cult followings. Wellness gurus offer cleanses that border on purification rites, and conspiracy theories spread with the fervor of apocalyptic prophecies. The mediums have evolved, but the human craving for intermediaries to interpret life's chaos hasn't dimmed. Yet the most potent parallel lies in the priesthood's greatest trick, transforming service into supremacy. Ancient temples distributed grain during famines but demanded loyalty in return. Today's platforms offer free connectivity while harvesting attention like a modern tithe. The Aztec priest who declared a solar eclipse proof of divine displeasure finds his counterpart in the pundit who frames every storm or stock crash as karmic justice for societal sins. The mechanisms are sleeker, the scale global, but the core dynamic endures. Those who position themselves as gatekeepers of truth, whether spiritual or statistical, wield outsized influence. This isn't a call for cynicism, but clarity. Recognizing these patterns lets us spot the priestly playbook in action, the charismatic leader who claims exclusive access to hidden knowledge, the institution that frames dissent as blasphemy, the system that monetizes redemption. History's real lesson isn't that power corrupts, but that it disguises itself in ever new vestments. adapting its rituals to the anxieties of each age. The antidote, the same tool priesthoods once monopolized, education. Literacy broke their hold on sacred texts in the Renaissance. Digital literacy can demystify today's algorithmic oracles. So as the video ends, ask yourself, where do you see priestly power rising now? Is it in the influencer selling enlightenment via subscription, the corporation branding itself as a crusade, or the politician framing opponents as heretics? The past never truly leaves us, it just learns new disguises. Tap the like button if this journey through time made you rethink modern power structures. Subscribe to keep decoding history's hidden playbooks, and drop a comment below. Who wears the invisible robes of influence in your world? The conversation doesn't end here. It's been unfolding for 5